Void.net. Dakota War of 1862. From Wikipedia, the Free Encyclopedia, Part 1. Read by The Voice Before the Void. The Dakota War of 1862, also known as the Sioux Uprising and the Dakota Uprising, the Sioux Outbreak of 1862, the Dakota Conflict, the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, or Little Crow's War, was an armed conflict between the United States and several bands of the Eastern Sioux, also known as Eastern Dakota. It began on August 17, 1862, along the Minnesota River in southwest Minnesota. It ended with a mass execution of 38 Dakota men on December 26, 1862, in Mankato, Minnesota. Throughout the late 1850s, treaty violations by the United States and late or unfair annuity payments by Indian agents caused increasing hunger and hardship among the Dakota. Traders with the Dakota previously had demanded that the government give the annuity payments directly to them, introducing the possibility of unfair dealing between the agents and the traders to the exclusion of the Dakota. In mid-1862, the Dakota demanded the annuities directly from their agent, Thomas J. Galbraith. The traders refused to provide any more supplies on credit under those conditions, and negotiations reached an impasse. On August 17, 1862, one young Dakota with a hunting party of 3 others killed 5 settlers while on a hunting expedition. That night, a council of Dakota decided to attack settlements throughout the Minnesota River Valley to try to drive whites out of the area. There has never been an official report on the number of settlers killed, although figures as high as 800 have been cited. Over the next several months, continued battles pitting the Dakota against settlers and later the United States Army ended with the surrender of most of the Dakota bands. By late December 1862, soldiers had taken captive more than 1,000 Dakota, who were interned in jails in Minnesota. After trials and sentencing, 38 Dakota were hanged on December 26, 1862, in the largest one-day execution in American history. In April 1863, the rest of the Dakota were expelled from Minnesota to Nebraska and South Dakota. The United States Congress abolished their reservations. Section 1. Background. Previous treaties. The United States and Dakota leaders negotiated the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux on July 23, 1851, and the Treaty of Mendota on August 5, 1851, by which the Dakota were forced to cede large tracts of land in Minnesota Territory to the United States. In exchange for money and goods, the Dakota were forced to agree to live on a 20-mile, 32-kilometer, wide Indian reservation centered on a 150-mile, 240-kilometer stretch of the upper Minnesota River. However, the United States Senate deleted Article 3 of each treaty during the ratification process. Much of the promised compensation never arrived, was lost, or was effectively stolen due to corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Also, annuity payments guaranteed to the Dakota often were provided directly to traders instead, to pay off debts which the Dakota incurred with the traders. Encroachments on Dakota lands. When Minnesota became a state on May 11, 1858, representatives of several Dakota bands led by Little Crow traveled to Washington, D.C. to negotiate about enforcing existing treaties. The northern half of the reservation along the Minnesota River was lost, and rights to the quarry at Pipestone, Minnesota were also taken from the Dakota. This was a major blow to the standing of Little Crow in the Dakota community. The land was divided into townships and plots for settlement. Logging and agriculture on these plots eliminated surrounding forests and prairies, which interrupted the Dakotas' annual cycle of farming, hunting, fishing, and gathering wild rice. Hunting by settlers dramatically reduced wild game, such as bison, elk, white-tailed deer, and bear. Not only did this decrease the meat available for the Dakota in southern and western Minnesota, but it directly reduced their ability to sell furs to traders for additional supplies. Although payments were guaranteed, the U.S. government was often behind or failed to pay because of federal preoccupation with the American Civil War. Most land in the river valley was not arable, and hunting could no longer support the Dakota community. The Dakota became increasingly discontented over their losses. Land, non-payment of annuities, past broken treaties, plus food shortages and famine following crop failure. Tensions increased through the summer of 1862. Breakdown of negotiations. On August 4th, 1862, representatives of the northern Sisseton and Wahpeton Dakota bands met at the Upper Sioux Agency in the northwestern part of the reservation and successfully negotiated to obtain food. When two other bands of the Dakota, the Southern Mdewakanton and the Wapakute, turned to the Lower Sioux Agency for supplies on August 15, 1862, they were rejected. Indian agent and Minnesota State Senator Thomas Galbraith managed the area and would not distribute food to these bands without payment. At a meeting of the Dakota, the U.S. government, and local traders, the Dakota representatives asked the representative of the government traders, Andrew Jackson Myrick, to sell them food on credit. His response was said to be, "So far as I am concerned, if they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." But the importance of Myrick's comment at the time, early August 1862, is historically unclear. Another telling is that Myrick was referring to the Native American women who were already combing the floor of the fort's stables for any unprocessed oats, to then feed to their starving children along with a little grass. Myrick was later found dead, with grass stuffed in his mouth. Section 2. War. Early fighting. On August 16, 1862, the treaty payments to the Dakota arrived in St. Paul, Minnesota, and were brought to Fort Ridgely the next day. They arrived too late to prevent violence. On August 17, 1862, 4 young Dakota men were on a hunting trip in Acton Township, Minnesota, during which one stole eggs and then killed 5 white settlers. Soon after, a Dakota War Council was convened, and their leader, Little Crow, agreed to continue attacks on the European American settlements to try to drive out the whites. On August 18, 1862, Little Crow led a group that attacked the Lower Sioux or Redwood Agency. The warriors burned the buildings at the Lower Sioux Agency, giving enough time for settlers to escape across the river at Redwood Ferry. Minnesota militia forces and B Company of the 5th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment, sent to quell the uprising, were defeated at the Battle of Redwood Ferry. 24 soldiers, including the party's commander, Captain John Marsh, were killed in the battle. Throughout the day, Dakota war parties swept the Minnesota River Valley and near vicinity, killing many settlers. Numerous settlements, including the townships of Milford, Leavenworth, and Sacred Heart, were surrounded and burned, and their populations nearly exterminated. Early Dakota offensives. Confident with their initial success, the Dakota continued their offensive and attacked the settlement of New Ulm, Minnesota, on August 19, 1862, and again on August 23, 1862. Dakota warriors initially decided not to attack the heavily defended Fort Ridgely along the river. They turned toward the town, killing settlers along the way. By the time New Ulm was attacked, residents had organized defenses in the town center and were able to keep the Dakota at bay during the brief siege. Dakota warriors penetrated parts of the defenses enough to burn much of the town. By that evening, a thunderstorm dampened the warfare, preventing further Dakota attacks. Regular soldiers and militia from nearby towns, including 2 companies of the 5th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry then stationed at Fort Ridgely, reinforced New Ulm. Residents continued to build barricades around the town. During this period, the Dakota attacked Fort Ridgely on August 20th and 22nd, 1862. Although the Dakota were not able to take the fort, they ambushed a relief party from the fort to New Ulm on August 21st. The defense at the Battle of Fort Ridgely further limited the ability of the American forces to aid outlying settlements. The Dakota raided farms and small settlements throughout south-central Minnesota and what was then eastern Dakota Territory. Minnesota militia counterattacks resulted in a major defeat of American forces at the Battle of Birch Coulee on September 2, 1862. The battle began when the Dakota attacked a detachment of 150 American soldiers at Birch Coulee, 16 miles, 26 kilometers, from Fort Ridgely. The detachment had been sent out to find survivors, bury American dead, and report on the location of Dakota fighters. A 3-hour firefight began with an early morning assault. 13 soldiers were killed and 47 were wounded, while only 2 Dakota were killed. A column of 240 soldiers from Fort Ridgely relieved the detachment at Birch Coulee the same afternoon. Attacks in northern Minnesota. Further north, the Dakota attacked several unfortified stagecoach stops and river crossings along the Red River Trails, a settled trade route between Fort Garry, now Winnipeg, Manitoba, and St. Paul, Minnesota, in the Red River Valley in northwestern Minnesota and eastern Dakota Territory. Many settlers and employees of the Hudson's Bay Company and other local enterprises in this sparsely populated country took refuge in Fort Abercrombie, located in a bend of the Red River of the North, about 25 miles, 40 kilometers, south of present-day Fargo, North Dakota. Between late August and late September, the Dakota launched several attacks on Fort Abercrombie. All were repelled by its defenders. In the meantime, steamboat and flatboat trade on the Red River came to a halt. Mail carriers, stage drivers, and military couriers were killed while attempting to reach settlements such as Pembina, North Dakota, Fort Garry, St. Cloud, Minnesota, and Fort Snelling. Eventually, the garrison at Fort Abercrombie was relieved by a U.S. Army company from Fort Snelling, and the civilian refugees were removed to St. Cloud. Army reinforcements. Due to the demands of the American Civil War, the region's representatives had to repeatedly appeal for aid before President Abraham Lincoln formed the Department of the Northwest on September 6, 1862, and appointed General John Pope to command it with orders to quell the violence. He led troops from the 3rd Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment and 4th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment. The 9th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment and 10th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which were still being constituted, had troops dispatched to the front as soon as companies were formed. Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey also enlisted the help of Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley, the previous governor, to aid in the effort. After the arrival of a larger army force, the final large-scale fighting took place at the Battle of Wood Lake on September 23, 1862. According to the official report of Lieutenant Colonel William R. Marshall of the 7th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment, elements of the 7th Minnesota and the 6th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and a 6-pounder cannon, were deployed equally in dugouts and in a skirmish line. After brief fighting, the forces in the skirmish line charged against the Dakota, then in a ravine, and defeated them overwhelmingly. Iowa Northern Border Brigade. In Iowa, alarm over the Santee attacks led to the construction of a line of forts from Sioux City to Iowa Lake. The region had already been militarized because of the Spirit Lake Massacre in 1857. After the 1862 conflict began, the Iowa legislature authorized not less than 500 mounted men from the frontier counties at the earliest possible moment, and to be stationed where most needed, although this number was soon reduced. Although no fighting took place in Iowa, the Dakota Uprising led to the rapid expulsion of the few unassimilated Native Americans left there. Surrender of the Dakota. Most Dakota fighters surrendered shortly after the Battle of Wood Lake at Camp Release on September 26, 1862. The place was so named because it was the site where the Dakota released 269 European American captives to the troops commanded by Colonel Henry Sibley. The captives included 162 mixed bloods, mixed race, some likely descendants of Dakota women who were mistakenly counted as captives, and 107 whites, mostly women and children. Most of the warriors were imprisoned before Sibley arrived at Camp Release. The surrendered Dakota warriors were held until military trials took place in November 1862. Of the 498 trials, 300 were sentenced to death, though the president commuted all but 38. Little Crow was forced to retreat sometime in September 1862. He stayed briefly in Canada, but soon returned to the Minnesota area. He was killed on July 3, 1863, near Hutchinson, Minnesota, while gathering raspberries with his teenage son. The pair had wandered onto the land of white settler Nathan Lamson, who shot at them to collect bounties. Once it was discovered that the body was of Little Crow, his skull and scalp were put on display in St. Paul, Minnesota. The city held the trophies until 1971, when it returned the remains to Little Crow's grandson. For killing Little Crow, the state granted Lamson an additional $500 bounty. For his part in the warfare, Little Crow's son was sentenced to death by a military tribunal, a sentence then commuted to a prison term. Continued in Part 2.